So the topic today is community engagement for clinical research. Community engagement is a term that we use that's synonymous maybe with patient engagement, which you might have heard, and really includes engagement of multiple stakeholders, community partners, patients, caregivers, and others in the external to Stanford. So my name is Lisa Goldman Rosas, as Susan said, and I'm accompanied by Patricia Rodriguez Espinosa and Katherine Connors, and we will introduce ourselves in just a minute. Patricia, can you advance the slide, please? Okay, so we're going to be together for the next 2 hours, and we would really like this to be an interactive session. So we hope you are prepared to participate actively. We are very welcoming of questions, comments, and your ideas throughout the presentation. We will be monitoring the chat, so please actively and liberally use that chat. When one of us is talking, the other will be monitoring the chat, and we'll try to get to questions and comments as we go. There will be times where we stop sharing the slides, and we'd love for you to turn your camera on and unmute yourself so that we can see each other and have somewhat of a conversation. And now, Susan, if you could put up that first poll, we just want to get a sense of the audience before we get started.
Absolutely. I'm just having some technical difficulty here. If you don't mind, I'm gonna pause the recording and restart again.
No problem.
Just in a second.
No problem.
Sorry for that. I don't know what's happening here.
Maybe while you're figuring that out, we will do our introductions. So
sure.
Okay. And as soon as the poll comes up, you can just put it up and we'll stop. So I am a faculty member in our Department of Epidemiology and Population Health. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I also have an appointment in the Division of Primary Care and Population Health, which is in the Department of Medicine. I do research that focuses on chronic disease prevention. So I work closely with many of our community clinics in our local area, as well as with patients, their families, and many other key stakeholders to design research that helps us to identify successful strategies for preventing chronic conditions such as diabetes, depression, and cancer. And I'll pass it to Patricia and she can introduce herself as well.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for joining us for the majority of your morning today. I'm Patricia Rodriguez Espinosa, as well as Lisa, in the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health, and I'm the Associate Director of Research for Office of Community Engagement here at Stanford. I've been at Stanford for a few years. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. My passion for many years has actually been in community engagement as a method of research or an approach to research that is more culturally appropriate, more culturally relevant oftentimes. And I've done a lot of work in what is the science of community engagement, what are some of the best practice, how can we integrate it further into many of the work that we do that works with minority and diverse populations. I have a special interest in the Latinx community and in chronic disease prevention as well. And I will pass it on to Katherine.
Good morning. The video seemed to change a little bit, but hopefully you can see me all right. Good morning, I'm Katherine Connors. I'm honored to be here with Lisa and Patricia, the community engagement experts. I am the manager for research participation services in the Research Office School of Medicine. So at the end of the presentation today, I'll be going into detail about some resources you can use around participant recruitment. But hopefully with this presentation, you'll be really looking at it from this community engagement lens. So excited to be here.
Great, thanks, Katherine. Patricia, if you can go to the learning objectives slide, that'd be great.
Do you see
perfect timing. Okay, so we have the poll. So before we get started, we would like to know how much experience you have with community or patient engagement. Use your own judgment. You can say a lot, some, a little, or none. Great. I see lots of you answering. This is wonderful. All right, looks like we have about 7 more of you to answer. Go ahead and enter your responses. Almost there. Just a couple more. Uh-oh, people are coming in and increasing our denominator. Okay, and I see an answer in the chat. Thank you. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and end that poll and we can take a look at the answers. Great, so it looks like a somewhat even distribution. So we have about 28% of you who have a lot of experience, and I recognize a lot of your names here in the participant list, so welcome. We're excited you're here. We have 30% or so that have some experience, 24% who have a little, and 24% who have none. So this is really wonderful. I really want to encourage you that have a lot and some experience to please add in the chat when you have an idea or perhaps an experience that you've had that relates to what we're talking about on screen, and go ahead and ask those questions so we can make sure and meet you where you are. And for those of you who have a little and none, we really hope to provide some of the basics today to take you to the next level. And I think it's wonderful that you can contact lots of your colleagues here. So we have a number of people who really do have quite a bit of experience, and you have a number of colleagues now who can help you when you need additional support in this topic. Great.
Lisa, I'm so sorry. It seems my technical difficulty continues. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna leave, come back again, and then start recording. If you can give me maybe 2 seconds, I don't want to go on without being able to record this. So I wanna make sure that I'm able to record this. So I'm gonna leave and assign you to it and then come back again. So
okay, we'll wait
sorry
for you.
for this technical difficulty. Maybe
no
Lisa
worries.
will help solve that.
Yeah, we can maybe cover learning objective and the outline and
Sure.
timing for today before any content.
Thank you so much. I'll be back in a minute.
It does
No
say it's
worries.
recording, for what that's worth, Susan. In the top left of my screen, it says recording.
Same.
It does,
here.
but it's not moving for some reason. I'm thinking it's probably not recording the shared screen. So my worry is then it's not going to record the slides. That's why at my end, I have this difficulty.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and share the learning objectives while we get started. So at the end of this session, we're hoping that you'll be able to list at least 2 or 3 principles of engagement and discuss their applications across the translational research spectrum. And when I talk about translational research spectrum, it's really acknowledging the fact that we do different kinds of research. So some of those that are really early stage in the translation, and some of those are later stage. And the spectrum really refers to that bench to bedside idea, or we like to say bench to bedside to curbside, right? So getting answers out into the community. Second is describe 3 challenges and 3 advantages of community engaged research relative to traditional biomedical models of research. Compare and contrast community engaged research with traditional biomedical models of research. We're going to spend a little bit of time helping you to craft a plan for integrating engagement into your own research. And then finally, list 2 to 3 Stanford resources for increasing the amount of engagement and participation from the community in research here at Stanford. Next slide. So here's our outline. We will do an introduction with some basics of community engaged research second. We'll go through the principles of community engagement, then discuss challenges and advantages, Crafting your own plan will be an interactive section of the morning, and then finally we'll end with some resources. Want to also give you kind of a timeline and who will be facilitating. So you can see here on the slide the different sections and who will be facilitating. We don't have a break built in just because we're trying to pack in so much, but of course, feel free to take a break when you need it. And we hope to end with ample amount of time for question and discussion so that we can try and address all the different levels of experience with engagement. All right, so let me check with Susan and see if we are okay with the recording.
Thank you. Yes, it's working now. Great.
Wonderful. That was perfect timing. Okay,
Sorry
so
about that.
that's okay. So we're going to start with the basics of community engaged research. You can go to the next slide. So I want to start with a definition. There are many definitions of community engaged research out there, and you can go ahead and Google them. This is one that we really like. I'll read it aloud and you can see it on your screen. It's a collaborative approach that equitably involves all partners in the process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. Begins with a topic of importance to the community with the aim of combining knowledge and action for social change to improve community health and eliminate health disparities. So I'll just note some of the key features of this definition. I see a question in the chat. Oh, no, that was from the poll. Okay. So a collaborative approach, this means that researchers partner with the stakeholders whose health they're seeking to improve. So that could be patients, that could be neighborhoods, that could be other potentially caregivers, for example. I also want to note that it begins with a topic of importance to the community. So many of us who work on different research projects don't always pick the topic. Potentially it's given to you or it's chosen in some other way, perhaps by a funder or by a PI. But ideally, when working on community engaged research, you're working on a topic that is important to the group you're working with. And then I also want to highlight where it says unique strengths that each brings, and to remind us that while we have special knowledge about how to do research, in community engaged research, we recognize the expertise and the lived experience that patients and community members bring into our research. So I'll pause there and just remind folks to put questions and comments into the chat as we go. All right, next slide. All right, so let's break this down a little bit more. What do we mean by engagement? So this is the process of working collaboratively with stakeholders, communities, patients, providers, etc., to address issues impacting the well-being of the populations through research. So we recognize that for many of the communities we work with, research is not always the way that they seek to improve health, but it's one tool in the toolbox that we bring to community health to improve the health and well-being of people who live in that community. There's a spectrum of intensity of engagement that can be tailored to different phases of the research. We're going to talk about that spectrum of engagement, and I want you to be thinking about the different phases of research, from formulating the research question, designing the study, implementing the study, and thinking about dissemination. So we'll talk about different strategies that can be tailored to each of those different phases. And then second, who are we talking about engaging? So that's always a good question. You have to think about that for each research project. Could be patients and caregivers, could be providers and staff in community clinics or other healthcare systems, could be community-based organizations, clinics or healthcare systems, could be policymakers, and could be others. If people have other ideas about who we might engage, I would love to see that in the chat there. All right, next slide. Okay, so we're going to do a discussion question, and after I read it, I want to unshare the screen, and hopefully you can turn on your videos and we can see each other. So I want you to think of a research project that you're working on right now, and write in the chat who you would consider to be the community. And Patricia, if you can stop sharing, I'm hoping we can see everybody once we unshare the screen. So maybe in the chat you could write a simple sentence about the research project and then write who the community would be. Many thanks to our friend Inez. So she's working on a study related to increasing physical activity among older adults. I only know that because I know Inez, but she wrote that the community is older adults, affordable housing residents, and affordable housing sites. Thank you. I actually still see your screen, Patricia, but that's okay. It's okay. I don't know if we can see, oh, there we go. We can see everybody. Oh, wonderful. I'll see a lot more. Okay, so from Stephanie, doing a project on anemia during pregnancy, and her partner is postpartum patients and community birthing organizations. Wonderful. Donna, moving very fast, adults over age 18 within 100 miles of Stanford. So that is a very large community. Esther, adults with depression and or anxiety. Wonderful. Jonathan, early enrollment to cardiac rehab, engaging centers receiving patients in specific populations. Great, so that's an example of a key stakeholder entity, maybe a little different than the patients themselves. Wonderful. So when you think about community that your research affects, you always want to think about to whom or to what are the research results relevant. Great, so Sabrina, we have COVID positive populations. Asma, we have not a specific study, but would be the target population including the study. Great, I think you're getting it. Yue, OA research, older adult research maybe, adults with knee pain or something. You can tell me what OA stands for. Let's see, Lauren, community-based organizations in the Central Valley and parents of school-age children. Wonderful. Christina, adults with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, and Katherine, parents and children interested in COVID vaccine. Great. So when you identify who the community is that your research is going to be relevant to, those are the groups that you want to think about engaging from the get-go in the research process to ensure that the research results are relevant and specific to that population. And so that's really the purpose of what we're talking about today. Great. Thank you everybody for sharing. I really appreciate that. All right, we can go ahead and share the screen again. Thank you, Patricia. Go to the next slide. Great, so this is a graphic. You can also find this online. If you Google spectrum of engagement, you'll see lots of different versions of the spectrum of engagement. The spectrum of engagement goes from the left-hand side, where we call it outreach, to the right-hand side, where we call it shared leadership. And I want to take you through each step. I also want to say that there is no right or wrong way to do engagement. We're not here to tell you that shared leadership is better than outreach. We want to identify that there are steps that everybody can take along the spectrum of engagement to incorporate strategies into your research. If you're just starting out, you might start out with outreach or consult. If you've already done quite a bit of work in this area, you might move down the spectrum and think about how to collaborate or share leadership in research. So on the end of outreach, we talk about some community involvement. The goal here really is for researchers to share information about the research widely with organizations or people associated with that target population or priority population that your research focuses on. So this is about really sharing information. So if you wanted to measure your success of engagement in this left-hand side of the spectrum with outreach, you would do a survey to find out, do people know about your research? Do people know about the health topic that your research focuses on? As we move down, the next one is consult. So this involves a little more community or patient participation. There's communication that flows to the community and then back, right? So a researcher might go to a group of patients, like an advocacy organization, and ask for their input on a survey, for example, or ask for their input about how to disseminate the results of their study. So in this area, if you were to evaluate your success of engagement, you might measure the relationship with new organizations. Have you developed a relationship or a connection with different types of organizations? One innovative way that you could evaluate your success in this consult is to do social network analysis. You could see how many people you've reached with your research. So moving down, involving the community, there's more bi-directional communication at this level between your patient stakeholders or community stakeholders and the researchers. You might have, for example, a patient advisory board or a community advisory board that is integrally involved in all phases of the research. There's some sort of visible partnership at this stage. And you might actually, if you wanted to evaluate your success at this stage, think about evaluating the partnership itself. How does the advisory board feel about being involved in the research? How much of a stake do they have in the research? And there's a lot of cooperation at this phase. So as we move down, I'm going to lump collaborate and shared leadership together so we can get to the next slide. But in collaborate and shared leadership, this is where you start to see community or patients identifying the research question, finding a researcher to get involved in applying for a grant together, designing the research together, implementing the research. There might even be a community co-PI and an academic co-PI. We measure things like trust, partnership building, and impact in the community at large at these later stages. This is a challenge in our current biomedical model of research to implement this given funding structures and other ways in which academic institutions work, but incredibly fruitful when it comes to impacting community health. I'll pause there and see if there are questions in the chat. I see Patricia's been answering some questions. Great. I really like how Patricia reminded us instead we can think about research on the community, research with the community, or research by the community as you go down the spectrum. Really nice. Okay, great. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why you should incorporate engagement. So I think of maybe carrots and sticks when I think about why you should incorporate engagement. So the carrot would be how to increase motivation of patients and stakeholders to participate in research, how to increase acceptability and feasibility of study designs and study logistics, how to increase reliability and validity of study measures. If you partner with patients to identify measures that really get at the constructs that are important to them, you can increase the reliability and validity, especially the internal validity of your study. Increase cultural and social relevance to the population included in the study. Patients bring their lived experience and remind researchers to focus on topics that are really relevant to their lives. And then finally, increased potential of translating findings to the next phase or to implementation, which ultimately is the goal of doing the research, right? Making these findings applicable in the real world. So in addition to carrots, there are a number of sticks. Can you click to the next? Okay, thank you. So for one, increasingly, funders require you to incorporate engagement. And even if the funder on your current grant doesn't, the next one might. And so using engagement so that you're ready for that next grant is really important. Institutions increasingly want you to do it. For example, our Clinical Translational Science Award, also known as Spectrum here at Stanford, which is funded by NCATS at NIH, requires us to include it. Additionally, all comprehensive cancer centers are required by National Cancer Institute. So here at Stanford, we have a comprehensive cancer center, and we are also required to do engagement. So whether you're thinking about the carrots or the sticks, there are lots of reasons why you should incorporate engagement into your research now. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the principles of engagement. Next. So let's see, the next discussion question, and go ahead and use that chat again. What comes to mind when thinking about best practices of community engagement? Just put in words, values, something that might relate to a principle of engagement. Donna, thank you. Inclusive. Jessica, great. Empathy, trust. Berta, transparency. Stephanie, equitable. Emerald, partnerships. Wonderful. I see Asma, transparency. Daniela, cultural humility. Great. Respect, clarity. Really important. Establishment of trust. Great. Thanks, Esther. Jonathan, trust, openness, involvement, equity. Sabrina, beneficial, right? It's actually beneficial to the community. Really, really wonderful. Collaborative. Thank you, Inez. Socially just. Great. All right, we can go to the next slide. So want to think about kind of 5 buckets of principles to make it really simple. If you remember the research objectives, we wanted you to remember 2 or 3. So take a look at these and see which resonate to you. So I'll start up in the left-hand corner with cooperative and co-learning processes. The idea is that researchers and our partners, whether they be patients, community organizations, caregivers, etc., we are in a cooperative relationship. And we're teaching each other. Co-learning is a term that's used in community engagement to recognize that our stakeholders teach us and we teach our stakeholders. Second, long-term commitment. You might have heard of the term helicopter research, where researchers drop into a community, do their research, and leave. And that's opposite of the principles engagement. We get engaged and develop relationships that are intended to last beyond the grant period potentially, and really have a commitment to being there for the long haul. It might mean that while one research project is the impetus for developing a relationship in the community, and you engage in a research process together, the community may be able to identify that next research topic. And maybe you're the researcher that works on that, or maybe you help them to identify someone with that expertise. Third, power sharing and reflection around privilege. Understanding our own maybe identity, understanding the identity of our institution in the communities in which we work is incredibly important to be able to form equitable partnerships, acknowledging that oftentimes academic institutions hold a great deal of power in local communities, and finding concrete ways to share that power is important. That requires us to be open-minded, honest, transparent, and also importantly to acknowledge past injustices, whether committed by your own institution or the biomedical research enterprise in general. Fourth, research that builds on community strengths is incredibly important. Each community group or patient group that you work with will have numerous different strengths. Identifying what those are by asking and building on those strengths is incredibly important. I know from my own experience, I have been just completely excited and enthusiastic and surprised by the numerous strengths that you're able to find when you reach out and partner with community members. And then finally, community engaged research has a focus on capacity development. It's capacity development for ourselves as researchers. It's capacity development in the communities that we work in. A concrete example of an application of this principle is community members can be trained to collect data, can be trained in data analysis, can be trained in different dissemination methods. So when that research project is over, you've benefited the community by building capacity in different ways. Next slide. So challenges and advantages. We're going to talk now about some of the challenges inherent in community engaged research, and of course end on a positive note with the advantages.
Thanks,
So,
Lisa.
Is this your turn? Okay, great.
But you
Yep.
are welcome to continue.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa, for that. Hopefully that has given everyone a good preview of what we mean by community engagement. What are some of those key principles that we're trying to adhere to, and giving you a glimpse of the promise of community engagement in improving our research and our science. However, we also want to acknowledge that this is not easy work at times. First, I think one of the challenges that is often mentioned by many is that it requires an incredible amount of time and energy. We're talking about building an equal and oftentimes collaborative relationship with partners. Sometimes this includes many partners from different backgrounds. And we have to first overcome all the issues of mistrust in researchers, right? Those terms like helicopter research. I have heard drive-by research, many terms that have really negative connotations. And we have to acknowledge that oftentimes research has harmed these communities in the past. We also come from an institution that is perceived as having a lot of resources that oftentimes our community partners don't have. So it takes actually a lot of time to develop that relationship, to overcome that sense of mistrust at times, to even get started on the work. And like any relationship, it has highs and lows, right? You can think of this is a bus on a road, and sometimes that road might take you in different directions. There might be obstacles along the way. But thinking again, this is a long-term commitment that we have with our partners, but it absolutely takes an additional time, not just in that relationship and building that trust, but also you're incorporating feedback from a larger number of individuals now who are making decisions along with you in various stages of the research process. So that itself also adds some additional time and some additional energy. And oftentimes we run into this issue, the second bullet point here, that stakeholders' priorities might be different. I remember a story from a colleague, this was many, many years ago, but I haven't forgotten, a colleague in public health. He was doing some work trying to enroll children and families that were low income into safety nets. He wanted to enroll children and families in WIC and SNAP to help with food security. He had this initial relationship with a rural community, a small town, and he was going to events trying to say, can I be here? Can we start this program so we can help with enrollment? And the community came back to him and say, we don't need that. What we really need is a road. So the community shared, they only had a single road, they were really isolated, they were highly concerned in the event of a fire, of an emergency. That's what they wanted to work on. So they actually ended up working on that road first, making sure the community had more infrastructure. And it took years for them to come back. And then they eventually call him back and say, hey, are you still interested in setting up something to enroll people in WIC and SNAP? So a priority, a sense here of not just the time that it might take, but also that communities have different research priorities. And oftentimes this gets on the way of sustainability, right? We create interventions, we create programs that work really well within our institutions and our communities. And once we go out, we realize the community is actually not interested in that. They have a completely different need that they need to resolve first. And we might have as well that some of the stakeholders have different capacity of different experience with research. There might be some education that's needed about what we can and we cannot do as an institution, what we expect from the partners. So this all builds into that time that we have to do in building those relationships and being very clear on what we're doing. And we might also follow different timelines, right? Here at our institutions, for example, we have to follow IRB first before we can do any studies. Sometimes that might be difficult for partners, especially that have not done research before, to understand why we need that timeline of grants and securing money. Why is the money not released immediately, even if we get the grant, the IRB? Or the community has different priorities and timelines in the sense of things that they need to do. Something that we see now with COVID-19 and many of the partners that we work with is that they have to completely reshift what they do in their organizations. Organizations that were before, for example, helping people with employment are now addressing food insecurity in the community or doing COVID testing or enrolling people in appointments for a vaccine. So they have also had to completely shift their priorities. So we need to be incredibly flexible when we're thinking about community engagement. So we're responsive to those priorities and needs for our community partners. Another one is finances. So Lisa alluded a little bit to this, in which oftentimes our budgets, our finances dictate what we need to do to fund our labs, to fund all of you, to fund staffs, to help students. And that might not necessarily align with what are some of the priorities from our community partners. It can also be very hard to do an equitable budget. In a couple of the prior slides, you saw power sharing is one of the key principles of community engagement and one of the best practices. And that can really show in our budgets. Do we have a budget where we are reflecting that some money is actually going to the community, that we're compensating partners for their time and their willingness to sit in advisory boards, for example? If we have a little bit of money for our research assistants, one thing that I often look at if I review applications is, could that money have gone to the community? Could they have hired somebody at a community organization to help with data collection, for example, which is another great way of increasing capacity for our community partners. But there can be a lot of barriers in terms of our institutions to be able to do that. How do we do contracts with our community partners? That can get fairly difficult at times. And the last point here is that oftentimes there's little or no funding for partnership development. So our funders oftentimes think, where is the study? What are you going to be doing? What are the outcomes? What are you going to be measuring? How are things going to be different? But going back to the first point here, sometimes if these are not established relationships, we need time to establish those, right? Your first step might be to have a lot of community meetings, asking feedback in the kind of research that you're doing, what the priorities should be for the next grant, for example. You might be convening a CAB if you're doing something a bit more structure in a way. So CAB, Community Advisory Board, it could be a patient advisory board, some other type of stakeholder advisory board. You might need some money for that compensation. You're establishing that relationship, but typically if it's not tied to a research study, it can be really hard to find funding for that. And I alluded a bit to some of these barriers that we just simply have different priorities, oftentimes different timelines and schedules. So now we bring in bureaucracies, not just from academic institutions, to whatever other institutions and sites we're also working with and trying to put all of those together. It can lead to an incredible amount of paperwork and barriers that we need to overcome. Not to say that it's not easy to overcome them. And once you have experience with them, at least you can anticipate them and it becomes a bit easier to navigate. And another point here is that we're still doing, even though community engagement is being more and more popular, we're still doing a lot of education, oftentimes within our own departments, with our own PIs, as well as with funders of organizations and study sections, in saying what is community engagement and what is our study looking a little bit different. So for instance, if we are asking for community feedback at the beginning on our intervention or our program, perhaps our next stages in our study are not very clear developed yet because we're waiting for that feedback to actually inform the work and inform the next stages. But oftentimes funders or others have a hard time seeing that. What is everything not completely laid out yet? What is this a little more flexible and a little bit more fluid? So we're still doing some education, but that is oftentimes changing and changing for the better now. So that was quite a bit on challenges, but there's also many advantages. This is what some of us here have dedicated our work here, and many of you expressed in that poll, about half of you, that you actually had quite a bit of experience with community engagement. So what are some of the advantages that you can think of or that you have experienced yourself by using community engagement? If you can add some to the chat, what are some of the good things that have emerged for you? Or if you have less experience with community engagement, what are some of the things that you expect or that you hope that this would lead to? Feel free to add those to the chat. Thank you. So Alice saying connection. Yeah, so absolutely adding a bit more to that relationship, extending our networks of people that we work with. Jonathan, understand the issues as they are, the eyes and ears, absolutely, right? The communities on the ground, they know exactly what's going on, what do they need. In this case, where the spectator, I really like that comment, Jonathan. I think it really goes to that co-learning piece and to acknowledging that communities have a lot of knowledge themselves. Higher likelihood of long-term engagement, absolutely, right? They've been engaged with you since the beginning, very likely they're gonna stay with you at the end. Donna, interdisciplinary collaboration or cooperation, absolutely. Ines, more participation, absolutely. They have bought in. They've been in the study with you since the beginning. They've been able to add to the design of the study, maybe have discussed with you over some of the priorities. So they're much more likely to help you now once you're in the middle of the study with participation, recruitment, etc. Results in better research questions from Stephanie, absolutely better research questions. Sustainability of the project, many of you have been alluding to that. Jake, establishing trust and transparency. Esther, produce research that can be generalizable to wider audience, more positive impact in underrepresented communities. Absolutely, a reminder that one of the key principles or practices oftentimes of community engagement approaches is that there is a very explicit social justice and social change component to it. It allows for more meaningful, useful impact. That's longer term, absolutely. Meaningful learning. These are all amazing, amazing comments and absolutely to the core of why, even though this might take a little bit longer and it might take more extra steps, it is completely worth it to do it. I will move us. Thank you so much to all of you sharing in the chat. And I will move us to this slide, just basically summarizing what you have said in your chat comments. Many of you alluded to this already, is that we are indeed doing better science and we have better answers and built-in sustainability. I think these two are the two promises and premises of community engagement, that by doing this, we're impacting this too. In the better science, absolutely, we're coming up with better research questions, designs, reach efficacy and effectiveness, right? We're not doing work in a vacuum in our labs. We're not just doing lead searches and trying to imagine where we should take the work next, but we have many partners that are helping us inform on what are actually the key needs of the community. How can we do research in a perhaps a different way, a way that's more culturally centered, more effective, a way that takes into account the many ways of knowing and ways of learning of our community, and adding that to our empirical science base. And the second bullet point here, we can increase the diversity of our research participants in a way that we cannot do alone by ourselves, and that we cannot do if we simply stay within the bounds of our labs and within the bounds of our School of Medicine or university. But we're truly out there participating and collaborating with those that we hope to have an impact with. And the second, as many of you said, there is absolutely better answers. We have better science along the way, and there's built-in sustainability. Unfortunately, in traditional science, we think of sustainability at the very end of the study, right? People conduct a full study, and once the grant is finishing, once the study is wrapping up, they start thinking, oh, what do we do next? How do we retain individuals in the study? How do we maybe retain staff? How do we keep this project going on in the community? We're doing it at the very end. Something that community engagement does is that it flips that around. And since the beginning, when we're talking with partners, we're talking about sustainability. Where all you saw long-term commitment is one of the principles of community engagement. It is in almost every single conversation. How do we do this? How do we make sure that this is a project that actually stays? And capacity development comes here as well. If we have been doing a project that really involves the community members and the partners, they have been learning how to do the work. Perhaps it's how to do the research. Perhaps it's an intervention that you have, and some of the community partners have been trained in delivering that. Even at the money end, and we have to retreat as a university partner, they're much more likely to be able to carry that forward on their own and actually not need you next time that they need to do an evaluation or a program. So that is one of the key aspects of making sure they're incorporated in all aspects of the research process, and that there is capacity development for both sides. We have more scalable interventions. Oftentimes, this is some of the wonderful work, oftentimes from public health, for instance. We have stories of work developed in Minnesota with middle-class Americans who are not perhaps very diverse. It works incredibly well. And then they try to take that and do the same intervention in a Latinx community in Chicago, and it absolutely does not work. And then everyone's surprised about how that happens. And again, community engagement flips that and say, that community should have been at the table with you. You have been thinking about scalability since the beginning. And there's a lot of evidence out there saying that by engaging in this kind of work, we actually have a higher chance of bringing about population level health improvements. Communities are oftentimes galvanized and activated and want to keep working. They have had a good experience, likely as a result of working with you in this different way, on this different approach. And there's also evidence that for the research partners themselves, oftentimes that health improvements, right? So many of you working on cancer, on diabetes, etc. There are many health behaviors that your community partners are likely to learn more about and engage in as a result. And then that capacity development now as well. I have a study showing that people are more likely to gain research skills and as a result get better jobs, have higher reputation in the community. Community organizations are more likely to be able to pursue grants on their own and get those grants. Think again of what that does for sustainability and for what the community's partners can do on their own now. So there's tons of evidence to support that we're doing better science and we're getting a better answers and better sustainability. And before we touch on a bit on the issues of trust, oftentimes in researchers and in academic institutions, So hopefully this is allowing partners to have a much better experience working with you and with your lab, much more likely to come back to you in the future with more studies, with more research ideas, and hopefully try to get a different experience and a different perspective and heal some of that unfortunate and oftentimes traumatic experiences of working with academic institutions. Any questions at this point? I don't see anything in the chat, but I'll stop here. We cover some challenges, some advantages. No comments or questions? Okay, I will move us to the next section. So we wanted to compare, you're getting a lot of sense of community engagement. Some of you have a lot of experience in this area, and we've been oftentimes comparing to traditional research approaches. This is also one of our learning objectives, just for you to get a sense of one or two areas in which community engagement is a little bit different in that approach. So thinking about, on your left, you're going to be seeing what's the research stage from the very beginning of identifying the research questions to dissemination all the way at the end. We'll be talking about how traditional research might approach, especially traditional biomedical research might approach this, how is community engagement different, and what the outcome will be. So for instance, one of the first aspects that we do in research is identifying a research question, a research problem that's going to dictate what the study should be about. Oftentimes in academia, we have researchers who have spent their life trying to develop expertise in a very particular area. Perhaps a funder says, I'm giving money to study cancer in children between the ages of 10 and 12. And a ton of researchers try to pursue that. So this is an example of the researchers, of their funders really dictating what the research priorities or the problem areas are. In community engagement, we do it a little bit different. Remember, this is collaborative. There's a co-learning process. So we're oftentimes doing that together with our partners. We take a step back. I think Jonathan made a comment earlier of we're just simply observers. So the community oftentimes dictates what's the research question, what is the priority that they have, and we try to be helpful and bring the skills that we have that are relevant to that. And the outcome is that, of course, this increases motivation of community partners to participate and collaborate with us because we're doing something that is actually relevant to them. Then the next stage, let's say we have a research question that's of interest to many of the parties involved. Now we have to design a research study or seek funding, perhaps not unexpectedly in traditional academia, the researcher or the lab entirely takes care of that process, right? They decide what the methods are gonna be, how they're gonna pursue the funding, what the aims of their study are gonna be. They absolutely design everything. In community engagement, of course, it's a little bit different. We're involving our community partners in that design. We're integrating their voices. We're really paying close attention to what are some of the community theories, what are some of the practices on the ground of what the community knows that work, that doesn't work. We pursue funding oftentimes together, so it might take a little bit of time to do it, but we might pursue funding that allow us to actually do the work that we want to do instead of having pursue funding that then we realize has some constraints and doesn't allow us to do the work. And of course, this increases acceptability of our study approach. Remember, they have been at the table telling us what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what will work better, and we're pursuing funds that allow us to collaborate. I mentioned before that oftentimes funders were not allowed for a very particular thing. If your partners have been on the table, there have been some discussion about is that funding that we should be pursuing then. Then oftentimes another area is the developing of measures. How are you gonna capture the information? Oftentimes in academia, we think about what has been testing in a certain population, what's a published method or instrument. Many of you would not be surprised that oftentimes that instruments are incredibly long. We're asking community partners to answer 50, 100 questions to come to the lab and take measurements for 2-4 hours. If we're doing community engagement, oftentimes our partners would advise you that that is not feasible for the community, or that we need to incorporate other areas. We need to decrease barriers to participations. They would advise us in that. And oftentimes we also use methods that might be less objective. In a way, there's a lot of qualitative work that is done in community engagement, a lot of mixed methods research. We're trying to get at the question in a variety of ways, and we're absolutely increasing reliability and validity. We're really going after the research question. We're making sure that we get the voices from community members.
I'll answer the question in the chat as you keep going.
Yeah, I'm reading the question. So Daniela said, if the main topic of the research study is not picked by the community, it would not be considered CVPR. Not necessarily. So CVPR, for those of you not familiar, is community-based participatory research. It's within the umbrella of community engagement. If you were here when Lisa showed the spectrum slide, it would be all the way on the right. Yes, left, right. So sort of like the goal of any engagement, in which there's through shared leadership, is very equitable. So let me see, the question is, if it's not picked by the community. Oftentimes in CVPR, it's very community-centric, so the community has a lot of power in decision-making, but it's an equitable partnership, so oftentimes the decisions are made together. So I think it could still be in that umbrella, Daniela, but great question about also differentiating CVPR from other community engaged approaches that might be less intensive or a little bit to the left side in that continuum of engagement. Let me see, another one here. So oftentimes too, we're redefining our studies, we're refining our interventions. Again, we tend to do that on our own. If we're oftentimes in academia, we do it within our own circle of colleagues, we do it within our own lab. If we're doing some engaged approach, stakeholders are oftentimes guiding that intervention development. That intervention might look a little bit different. We're putting more weight on the community. We're putting more weight on community ways of knowledge, on traditional values of that community, traditional approaches. I think this is absolutely one of the key strengths of community engagement, is that we're not doing an intervention and then at the end saying, okay, let's just translate it into Spanish, or let's just translate it into Mandarin, or let's just put some feathers on it. And then now it's tailored for other communities. We're absolutely not doing that in community engagement. We're putting really culture and the community at the center. And we're arriving at programs and at interventions that are culturally centered. And I use the word center instead of words like tailor, adapted, for example, which shows that that came oftentimes as a second or an afterthought to the development. And we're absolutely increasing the likelihood of now producing more positive change, something that many of you highlighted as something that you have experienced perhaps in your work that's community engaged. And then we're moving into another stage of the research. If like now we're collecting data, we're implementing our work. Oftentimes recruitment in academic institutions happens within our walls. We're responsible for it. I like to highlight, this is oftentimes the first time we hear of a lab wanting a consultation with our office, the Office of Community Engagement, of a team saying, we're struggling with this study, could you help us? Oftentimes they're already at this stage. This is when they're realizing, okay, something's not working, maybe we have missed something. But notice how many steps there have been missed along the way. So oftentimes we have a really hard time here in trying to help, because there's many other layers and pieces that now we have to overcome. And oftentimes it can be difficult for communities as well when they're approached at this stage and they didn't have an opportunity to have given feedback or have been at that table when you were thinking about the study, when you were thinking about the measurements, when you were refining things. So we oftentimes think as early as you can in the research process, start engaging, start asking for help. We're very willing to do consultations and to help you think through all of this. And this is why we're here today. If you have some questions about how can you move to get feedback to an earlier stages, how can you do some of these pieces, please put it in the chat. This is a great opportunity to get some personalized feedback today. And we're absolutely enhancing recruitment and retention because your partners have been included since the beginning. They're committed to it and they're oftentimes helping you in it. And that has been something that's built into the process. And finally, as Lisa mentioned, oftentimes in community engagement, we are indeed the community partners are collecting the data, they're analyzing the data, they're oftentimes with you in presentations. They tend to be co-authors on publication, for examples, and they also push us to think beyond publishing in just peer-reviewed journals or doing some traditional disseminations. They oftentimes push you into thinking, what are some other ways that you can get the information to the community? Should you be doing, for example, a policy brief, an ad on the paper? There can be a public service announcement on the radio. Maybe you should do that in a variety of languages. Maybe you can collaborate with local artists and do some artwork that has some educational or some result that is helpful for communities or for patients. So oftentimes an advantage is that they help you push your dissemination and your translation into a completely different arena. So I'll stop there. Any other questions for this section? Okay, so Asma has a question. Asma, I'm gonna say, hold that thought for a second. Katherine will be talking a lot about recruitment towards the end of the presentation. So if that doesn't answer your question, please put it back. And she'll be showing some resources that we have here on campus. Okay, so we hope that this next piece is a little more participatory. We're hoping that you are seeing a lot of information in this first hour, but now have a chance to thinking, what are some areas that perhaps you can integrate some of these ideas in? If you're already doing them, maybe it's how do you move it one step further? How do you make it a bit more institutionalized in a way? If you have had some informal practices, how do you make them a little bit more formal? If this is a completely new area for you, just thinking, what are some small steps that you can start taking in this area? So I'll pose a few questions for us. First is thinking about a project perhaps that you have at the moment or that you would like to have or that is coming in the pipeline of your work and your lab in which you'd like to apply community engagement principles. It can be a few of them. It can be a lot of them. If you have a piece of paper, please think through those, put some thoughts down, do some brainstorming here. And think a little bit of what is it that you'd like to accomplish? If there's something that you have thought, we're doing this in my lab, but it's not working quite well. We oftentimes come up with the same challenges, study after study. How can we do things a little bit differently? What do we want to do that do we want to accomplish? And how can community engagement help you strengthen that potential project? So Donna had a comment, longitudinal or long-term engagement in longitudinal studies. Absolutely, right? So very hard to engage participants in a single study, much more keep them over a long time, or we can think too of developing multiple studies in a research area. Other projects, other things that people are thinking of.
Patricia, perhaps we can let people unmute and share at this stage. I think we have a little bit of time and maybe stop sharing so we can see each other. I don't know if Susan can unpin us so that we can see everybody in gallery view.
I see everyone on my gallery view.
You do? Okay, I don't. I think it's my problem.
Yeah.
Got it. I think it would be great if people can turn on their video and unmute. And at this point, it would be a great time to share information about specific studies where you're thinking about including engagement. Ah, I see a video. Hi, thank you. So go ahead and turn your video on and unmute. So what we're looking for now is share an example study where you're thinking about including engagement. At this stage, we're not asking you to come up with the engagement yet. That'll come next, but maybe just give some examples.
I can go, Lisa.
Hi, Jake.
Hi. So we're starting a study with the pediatric population for the vaccine study. So engaging the kids, but more importantly, their parents and wanting to get them vaccinated.
Yeah. Excellent example. We'll use that example. Let's see, let's take some others.
I'll go. So we have a 5-year study, the Project Baseline study, where we're following people who have to wear a digital health monitor. And I'm finding that we're having a problem retaining people to wear the watch over 5 years. So they stay engaged with the study, but not necessarily the digital technology.
Oh, that's a great example. I know some of your participants, so that's, I suppose everybody knows some participants in Project
Yeah, and I know
Baseline.
Jake over there too.
Lots of Baseline participants, even in my family. Okay, let's take some others. Don't be shy.
I can go. Sorry, I can't share my video because I'm driving, but
that's okay. Thank you.
I am helping start up an outpatient COVID study. And I think numbers are going down, so that's great for the community. But I think because there's a lot more, like the vaccines are rolling out and there's like some FDA approvals for like COVID treatment, like people aren't as willing to enroll in this study because they'd rather just go with what's standardized now.
Right. Excellent. So, what we were going to ask you to do next is identify a challenge. So I know for Donna, you for Project Baseline, one of the challenges is engagement with the digital technology. And Jake, you didn't say your challenge, but as a parent, I'm guessing parent concerns about COVID vaccines for children is one of the challenges you'll face. Do you have others?
Yeah, and similar with what we did with the last vaccine trial with your team is also making sure that it's a diverse population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Sabrina in the car is talking about trials for COVID treatments, especially considering people may choose standard of care right now. Do you have challenges around recruiting diverse samples as well, diverse populations as well, Sabrina?
Yes, I predominantly work at the Pleasanton Valley Care site. I mean, I work at both Maine and Valley Care, but especially in Pleasanton, there's a very, very high population of Latin Americans. So diversifying that has been an issue as well.
Right. And Donna, do you want to say what you mean by heterogeneity in the population when using tech? Does that mean people's familiarity with technology?
It's a couple of things, because there's an inherent bias when you bring tech into a population. So some people are just not going to be able, some populations will be left out due to they don't have Wi-Fi. I mean, you're seeing this in a school population right now where they're not familiar with or able to utilize tech during a pandemic or in a longitudinal study. So there's somewhat of a selection bias when it comes to using tech in a study. And there's somewhat of a selection bias in our Stanford population.
Great. Okay, and Jonathan, could you share a little bit more about what you wrote in the chat?
Sure, thank you, Lisa. So can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you though.
I'm not able to share the video at this time.
Got it.
Earlier I put in a question like engaging patients to participate in early cardiac rehab.
Uh-huh.
And we have a large population who would be benefited from it, but we're finding like 7% rate of engagement there to 12%. So want to see what the barriers are, understand that from the community aspect, and then see what interventions will work to change the behavior very specific to early enrollment and participation. The desired participation is 36 sessions, which would take about 3 to 4 months to achieve the benefit, the clinical benefits. That's the whole part of my engagement.
Jonathan, where are you in the research process? Do you have funding already, or are you still pursuing grant funding?
I'm still writing the protocol.
Writing protocol. Okay, great. And then Asma, do you want to share a little bit about your specific sample, your specific question around recruitment, what the study is?
Yeah, hi. I'm not able to share my video either. But my question was, I help in the administration of scientific review committee at the Cancer Center. And my question was more to do with if we see a lot of studies which are not recruiting well, once they have started, we at times ask for a recruitment plan. Is there any tool that we can provide to those investigators to help create and think of a recruitment plan that is actually effective? Got it.
Great. So I'm sorry. Did I cut you off?
Just was thinking. Yeah, that was my question.
Perfect. So these are some great examples. So just to remind everybody, we have a couple ones to think about. So we have the pediatric COVID vaccine trial interested in engaging parents who may have concerns about vaccines for children, and also interested in ensuring they have a diverse population so that after the trial's over, parents can say, yep, my child or people that represent my child were included. We have the baseline study who's facing some challenges around engagement in longitudinal, 5-year-long studies, also especially related to using digital tools. We have the COVID treatment trial from Sabrina, who is thinking about how to increase participation, giving existing standard of care, and also seeking to maybe optimize and maximize diverse recruitment. We call that inclusive participation, right? And then we have, Jonathan, your study related to early cardiac rehab, and you're talking about engagement in an intensive intervention. So how do you get maybe improved engagement over that level of intensity of an intervention? And then Asma, and talking about how do we improve recruitment and retention to cancer clinical trials, it sounds like. And Alice, do you want to say what your example is?
Oh, you're muted, Alice.
Sorry about that.
There you are.
So it's a study that we're just writing now. We're very excited to try and help our Black patients with prostate cancer and to support their emotional well-being and cardiac well-being. And how do we engage our community there, especially when we think about mental well-being? There's a lot of stigma about counseling and receiving and having it funded even. So we want to try and overcome these barriers.
Awesome. That's an excellent example. Thank you so much, Alice. I appreciate that. Okay, so think of one of these examples, or you can continue to think of your own example even if you didn't share, and Patricia can lead us to the next question of what you're going to do with one of these example studies.
Yeah, are you seeing my slides, or do I need to reshare?
I think you have to reshare.
Okay, let me try that again. How's that?
Perfect.
You see it? Okay. Yep. So we talked a little bit about the studies, what you hope to accomplish. So next is trying to think How can you integrate community engagement to help you in those aims that many of you described? So this is a bit the more complicated piece, and the one that we're here for today is to think, what are some of the tools that you can use in that? So thinking of that, I like to help you think through a little bit of, you can think of this as a menu of options. Remember, there's a depth in community engagement. So thinking back about that spectrum slide from, you might be doing outreach, you might be doing some consultation, whether it was with the patients, with community organizations, with clinics, all the way to something that's more formalized, in which you might have some shared leadership. So think for your study and for your research question in particular, where is perhaps an appropriate place? Perhaps you're already doing outreach, for example. So thinking, how can you move and do a little bit of consultation? Or if that's where you are, how can you move to the next depth or the next stage in that spectrum of community engagement? And then the other one is, once you have that spectrum, what are some of the specific strategies that you're going to be using? So for instance, consultation can take a variety of forms, right? You might email somebody and say, we're doing this study. Can we tell you a little bit? Or we have this idea. We're interested or curious in what your organization is doing. Can we learn more from what you're hearing on the ground that perhaps might help us? Or it might be a little more formal, where maybe you take a few of those patients and you do some interviews with them. I'm thinking, Donna, of like your work in having people use the wash, for example, bringing some of the individuals who are not using it, perhaps were users and perhaps drop, and doing some interviews. What happened to them? What were some of the barriers that they were facing? What will help them? What would be something that will help them utilize more and utilize long term? You might have a range of options that you have thought about. You can share with them, or they can give you some other ones. Jake, for you as well, like you might do interviews or focus group with parents. What are some of the fears that they're having around vaccinating their children at the moment? You might think of teachers as another potential stakeholder that you can interview, do focus groups. What are they hearing on the ground as well? So it might be one way of obtaining some information, and it might be more or less formal. If you're not interested in publishing that, you might not need IRB approval if you're having some informal conversations with individuals. If they're already in your study, you might already have permission to contact them to ask, how can we keep you engaged? For instance, what will help for you to utilize this other tool or this new technology, as well as involving in the interviews and focus group. You can think you can do with patients, you can do with community organizations, but you can also involve them a little bit more in the recruitment or in the data collection, for those of you thinking that that's something that you like to accomplish. Ideally, for those of you, you are at the beginning stage, you're still thinking about the protocol, organizing a little bit. It's a great place right now to be reaching out to potential stakeholders and asking, how can we do this better? What will facilitate this for the community? What are some of the barriers that prevent many of the individuals in participating, whether it's technology, whether it's time, whether it's something you're doing maybe here at Stanford and it takes a lot for individuals to come and spend time on campus. How can we overcome those barriers? And same, oftentimes we think one of the ways in which we do capacity development and we share, if we're hiring within the study, instead of hiring perhaps a grad student, we hire within our organization. Oftentimes organizations have individuals that are not fully funded. Can you cover 20% of their time to help you in recruitment, for instance, right? To be one of the advisors. Maybe your study requires a bit more of recruitment and data collection. Can somebody outside of Stanford be doing that? And it's as a way to bringing them in. If you're thinking of something that's a bit more formal, some of you talked about a variety of studies. Perhaps your lab is moving in a different direction, or you know you're going to have a study for a really long time. It is absolutely worth it, and we recommend to have an advisory board. This could be a representation of many stakeholders. It could be some of the patients, it could be the parents, it could be teachers, it could be community organizations that you're working with. Asma, I'm thinking of you, and how do you help researchers with recruitment? It could be some of those same researchers as one of the stakeholder groups, but advising what are the barriers again, how can the study look a little bit different, or the protocols or the support here at Stanford look a little bit different, that is actually meeting more of their needs. And perhaps they meet a few times a year, perhaps they meet quarterly, so it might not take a huge amount of resources, but you have an actual formal way of receiving feedback from them in a variety of things. You might be facing a challenge today, but in 6 months, that challenge might look a little bit different. Or done a year long-term study, that might look very different in 3 or 5 years. But now you have this committed group of individuals who are oftentimes coming back and partnering with you. Another community engagement strategy that we oftentimes use is doing community events, doing outreach efforts in which might be sharing results perhaps from a prior study. We might be sharing what we're doing at the moment. And it might be as a way of forming that collaboration and saying, join us in this effort. But it might also be a way of saying, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, here's what we're offering, and just saying hi and just getting started in that, building that relationship and that collaboration. People might tell you what they're interested in, and you might just start to open the door for some more in the future. I'll stop here for a second. So for everyone to think through, what are some of those tools again that you might be thinking about, and what is that depth of engagement, right? Outreach might look very different. So you might be doing outreach and consultation and incorporating some interviews with individuals, with patients, providers, teachers, parents, all the way to something fairly formal, like you're actually forming an advisory board for your study. So think through what some of those studies that you share in the moment, and think what might be something either appropriate for your study or that you see feasible in the near future. So I'll stop here for a second so we can have a brief conversation. And if you unmute yourself again and then think through for some of the studies that were previously discussed or new ones, again, what are some of that depth of engagement in that spectrum of engagement, and what are some tools that perhaps you're thinking of?
This is Jonathan, I can go. And I was thinking that we would come up with from a survey to engage the community or different stakeholders, because different stakeholders may be a different method, and survey to a summit, because there are professionals in that, and also a registry. So there are a few things in the queue, but depends on protocol and then IRB approval. But this is at a high level, which I thought of for my project.
Mm-hmm. I really like the idea of the multiple ways of engaging, Jonathan. I think we think of multiple ways in which we think about getting at research questions, but that different stakeholder and different partners might actually be more receptive to one strategy over the other. So absolutely doing multiple things is always welcome. Lisa, you unmuted, so I'm not sure if you wanted to share something.
I wanted to say, I don't know if this would be relevant, Jonathan, but sometimes it can be helpful to host an educational event, like, for example, about the importance of engaging in cardiac rehab. I don't know if this is relevant for your topic, But sometimes a lack of awareness or maybe a perceived lack of importance of the topic in the community can make engagement and recruitment really challenging. And so by hosting educational sessions in partnership with community-based organizations, you can start to raise awareness. And that can also be a way where you can meet patient advocates or other advocates in the community that might be interested in getting more engaged with your project, that can really help recruitment and retention. It's all about ways of getting out there into the community. And nowadays you can do a lot of it on Zoom and not actually driving around the Bay Area. But of course, in-person engagement eventually will be possible.
Yeah, this makes me think earlier we talked about dissemination, and dissemination, oftentimes we think about findings, but it could just be dissemination of information in general or dissemination of the work that you're doing, and thinking of that in a more flexible and diverse way, not just presentations and PowerPoints and things that we oftentimes think in academia, but doing an event and just having people have fun and come together. Before it used to be over food, now it might be something different, having activities for families and just bringing the community together, and your dissemination is little d. You're giving, perhaps you have a pamphlet, you have some information about your group, but it absolutely opens the door for people to get to know you, to have a really pleasant experience, for you to be able to maybe contact them in the future and have some more networking for meeting the partners.
This is an excellent idea. Thank you, Lisa and Patricia. This is brilliant. Yeah, thanks.
I think that might also be relevant for you, Alice. I work with some organizations in Alameda County that are focused on raising awareness around breast cancer in the Black and African American community there. So we partner with community-based organizations and Black churches to raise awareness about the importance of clinical trials and breast cancer screening and diagnosis with our partners there. And as an initial start, one thing that we did was provide community partners with really small, like $500 to host events, and they designed the events themselves and we attended. So we could learn about how the community engaged each other around this topic, as opposed to us having ideas. And that was really helpful for us getting started. And now 2 years later, we have a collaborative research grant working on a project together. We have a community co-PI and an academic co-PI. So just an example of how getting out there, it can be slow to start, but I think your topic is actually really, really important in the community. We actually have someone on our advisory board focused exclusively on mental health aspect of breast cancer. So people are out there, and you will find them once you just start sharing your interest in the topic. So we'd be happy to help with that. And Jonathan asked, how do we connect with community partners or NGOs? Is there a list of partners to choose from? So there's no contact resource list for all community partners in the Bay Area, because it would be impossible to keep it up and impossibly long. But a really simple thing you can do is to reach out to us, and we can help identify either people who would know, or we might have some community partners in mind to help you out. So we'd be happy to do that. Let's see, which of the studies haven't we talked about yet? I think, Asma, for the scientific review in the Cancer Center, I want to really empower you. You're in a wonderful position to provide advice to a number of our cancer researchers here on campus. And I think what's really important to communicate to them is, first of all, once you hit problems with recruitment, is probably one of the hardest times to start doing engagement. The best time to do engagement is when you're designing the recruitment strategy in the first place. And so when people come through the scientific review process, asking them to come up with these plans at the get-go is really critical. As you can imagine, patients and community partners can be a little resistant when you approach them with, I have this problem with recruitment, I'm wondering how to get more people in my study, and the study's already designed, the people are already hired, the protocol's already done, and you're asking them to fit in to the process. It's much more successful when they can help you design the process in the first place. It doesn't mean there are no tools to do, but it's really limited, and it's an uphill battle at that point. Can be really challenging. So I don't know, Jake, if you would be willing to share, but we were able to have a lot of nice discussions at the beginning of one of our COVID vaccine trials here at Stanford about things that could be done at the get-go for designing the research process. And I would say all it takes is, a few members of your team having some experience and willingness to go out into the community and get feedback. And that really gets the ball rolling. I think Jake left and came back, so I don't know.
No, I'm still here. Okay. I just had to, I'm on the move now. Yeah, I think everyone on the page was like the most pivotal thing, like from the PI to the schedulers to assistant coordinators to the coordinators, having everyone know and have the same common goal, because it took a lot of communication between team members, but something that Patricia said was making concrete, achievable goals. So her example was having a goal for our cold callers who are scheduling to like make an additional 2 calls to a certain population. And so then everyone who's part of the team is prioritizing our goals, and our main goal was like diversity and inclusion. And even if it didn't result in enrollment, it still increases engagement in the community. And ultimately that was our goal for establishing trust of the vaccine.
Yeah. And I thank you so much, Jake. I appreciate that. And I think, Sabrina, with your topic on testing new treatments for COVID, I don't think we've talked about your topic, and I don't know if any of the ideas that we've talked about so far resonate. But another strategy we've been using is these large community town halls where we share information about the newest research related to COVID, and we've been reaching thousands of attendees each time. It tends to be a lot of people who are really engaged in research. Probably not a lot of people who have COVID at the moment, but they may have family members and they can share that information. So that occurs to me as one strategy. I think for the treatment trials, one of the most important things is staffing the team with coordinators and research assistants that look like and understand the community that's prioritized in the project. So one thing that a lot of our initial COVID treatment and vaccine trials did was make sure they have bilingual staff because of the predominant prevalence of COVID in our Latinx community here locally. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Sabrina, if there's been anything you've tried so far.
Oh yeah, I think the town hall idea is a really good idea that we haven't even looked at. But speaking of the bilingual part, I am bilingual, and so is one of our PIs. So I think that's actually helped us a lot.
Yeah.
Because I think the whole like using a translator kind of just like turns people off.
Yeah.
And that has helped a lot in terms of, because I'm running actually 2 COVID treatment trials right now. One's inpatient, and I'm starting up an outpatient trial right now. And the inpatient one, we haven't recruited anyone or like enrolled anyone in like over a month. Part of that is just because like the numbers are down, which is great for the community, not so great for our trial. But I think the other part of it too is that like I would say 90% of our participants are Spanish speaking, and since there's only 2 people on the team that speak Spanish, and like our bandwidths kind of get stretched a little bit, there is some times where like a translator has to be used, and people just like automatically get turned off by that. So, and with this outpatient trial, I'm the only one that speaks Spanish. So I am nervous about what that recruitment is going to look like because, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really smart, as much as everyone can advocate for increasing bilingual abilities on your teams. It's really critical. So I think we need to move to Katherine. Susan, thank you for sharing your question. We'll have time for questions after Katherine goes, and I'll read it and see if I can respond to anything as Katherine is talking.
1 second. Is it working?
Yes.
You got it.
Okay, excellent.
All right. Hi, everyone. That was really great information. Yeah, perfect. So this is me. You can reach us at engageparticipants@stanford.edu. We are largely funded by the CTSA award. Again, I'm in the research office of the School of Medicine. Next slide. So majority of studies don't draw enough participants. As you may know, participant recruitment is one of the greatest challenges to successful clinical research. We have lacked tools and processes that can significantly change this. And clinical trials also suffer from a lack of diversity and inclusion. So applying these principles we've talked about today is really important. I do tend to consult for clinical trials mostly, so not always as community engagement focused, but some definitely do. And I always have these concepts in the back of my head, just from my public health background and working with Lisa and team over the years. So I'm all ears for ways we can apply these principles more to even the clinical trial setting, clinic setting. But today I'm going to go over what we offer. I'll go through this quickly so we can have some time for questions. Next slide. So typically the current methods of outreach can be through physician contact, a clinic visit, community event, or flyers. This is, in some cases, this is really, leveraging the physician-patient relationship, but that's also very time intensive for the physician and team. It's not scalable for large outreach efforts, and it may not be applicable for all studies. So we have this new additional method called Honest Broker. So my office serves as the honest broker. We are sending study invitations on the study team's behalf to potential participants, mostly identified via STAR, but we want to expand that over time. And only when those potential participants express interest do we pass on their contact information to the study team. And this is really appealing from a privacy and compliance perspective, and we can centralize it and standardize it and scale it. Next slide. So quick overview, we provide resources and tools with a focus on engaging participants as partners in research. We provide consultations. We have our participant engagement platform, PEP, which is our Honest Broker services. I'll go into a little more detail. We mostly have direct email and Children's Epic MyChart available at this time. We have social media campaign resources, which can be really useful for reaching folks beyond Stanford who are, not Stanford patients. Community engagement. I'm often introducing study teams I've just met with to Patricia or Wei Ting or in Lisa's office to think about, are there community partners they could engage with? We also have the community advisory board that's run in SECR. I saw Nicole Ventry was on the line earlier. And that's I'll go into a little more detail, but it's a board of 15 to 20 community members where you can get feedback on your study design and recruitment strategies. And we also offer guidance about other resources such as our Stanford Research Registry and externally our Trial Innovation Network. And Maya was on the line. She's our new Trial Innovation Network hub manager. And so that's a really nice resource for multi-site trials. Next slide. Oh, real quick, sorry. That link there, I'm gonna just put it in the chat because I wanted to, as I was listening to Lisa and Patricia, I was thinking I wanted to just call out, from this page, you can link to a recruitment strategizing worksheet that I put together. It's a one-pager hopefully you can click that box link. It basically is a way to pepper yourself with questions, putting yourself in the shoes of your potential participants, thinking about what are their daily lives like, how might they learn of this information, what are incentives, what are barriers to participating. So I won't go through that, but I wanted to make sure you all had access to this worksheet because it's not that easy to find on the website. Okay, now next slide, thank you. So I generally get in touch with you all when I receive an email, and then we'll set up a 30-minute Zoom conversation, and I'll collect this information from you. Kind of to reiterate a theme that we're hearing today is that the sooner you can think about community engagement in your process, like really, speaking with your PIs about this, like in the pre-grant stage is really wonderful. I tend to also be contacted, when there's, I need help meeting we're behind schedule in our recruitment goals. And at that point, it's really too late to have meaningful partnerships, if you have a community focused study. So certainly differentiating, is this Stanford patients focused? So really, working from our EMR, or are we wanting to maybe think about our registry that's beyond Stanford or social media to engage? And then of course, if you have community partnerships established early on is wonderful. So yeah, and we'll talk through whatever you have tried. It's been a weird year for all of us where typical recruitment strategies may not work anymore with COVID shelter in place. So our honest broker method has been at least an additional option for folks. So we'll discuss strategies and available services. For our honest broker services, we do need Encore registration per participant accrual. And then I'll provide IRB modification guidance for using our services. Okay, next slide. So me and my colleagues, so I lead participant engagement, and then Jana Schulacher with Encore and Peg Sao with the CRU leads. And together we're trying to provide integrated support for your clinical research. Next slide. So for community outreach and engagement, as I mentioned, often connecting study teams with our colleagues in the Office of Community Engagement. And so upfront, we're determining, is this simply for advertising a study, which is useful, reaching out to patient advocacy organizations who may really support the work you're wanting to do and share it with their members is worthwhile? Or is it really working more in partnership with more equal influence on the project? And as we said, I think this quote was from your keynote speaker at the Community Health Symposium just last week. Best to build a partnership when you're not asking for something. And we've said this today as well. And so just a note, the community town halls that Lisa mentioned, there was a Latino town hall. OC has been sharing our Stanford research registry in those town halls, and the hope there is to really diversify our research registry makeup. That's an important goal for our registry and our outreach in general. The Stanford Community Advisory Board, that was launched in 2016, and it meets every other month. So if you're interested in getting community feedback, you could present to the board. And so it's enabling community members to participate in research planning and dissemination of findings. And then researchers get this feedback on recruitment strategies and reaching specific populations. And I remember the best, I used to co-run the board with Nicole, and I will always remember the best session or the most impactful session I felt was a PI coming pre-grant who, based on the community member feedback, fundamentally changed his study design on how he viewed controls versus cases for a study about stress in young children. And it was just really cool to witness his thinking evolve by listening to community members. Next slide. So on to our participant engagement platform. We generally, we're identifying potential participants based on your inclusion-exclusion criteria and pulling from the STAR database. Again, we want to be able to expand to other databases. And we have MyChart and direct email. And if your study is eligible for both, PEP actually determines for each potential participant what is the best method of contact for them based on MyChart usage and their email address on file. We're serving as the honest broker, as I mentioned, and PEP will soon track age, race, and gender metrics. And based on the results we're getting, we could modify our outreach to try to increase representation. So I'm really glad we're tracking that. It wasn't part of our 1.0 release, but it will be in the next edition. Next slide. So this is just, it doesn't look great on a PowerPoint slide, but to show you what our direct email invitation looks like. We have this wordy header at the top that is approved by our IRB compliance privacy folks explaining, because this is unsecure email. People are getting this in their personal email. It's not sent securely. And so this is eligible. I mean, your study can be eligible for this type of outreach if you include healthy controls. And that way we are not implying the recipient has a certain condition, which would be a HIPAA violation. So it's actually really awesome that we can use unsecure email for recruitment. That generally has been a no-no from a privacy compliance perspective, but in this format, we're able to do it. If you click on yes or no, that links into Qualtrics, and then folks can fill out their preferred contact information and leave any comments and submit. Then I am passing on only the folks who said yes, I'm passing their name and contact information onto you, the study team. And there's unsubscribe options there at the bottom. Next slide. And this is showing the My Chart. So we will have My Health, which is the adult hospital side, available by the end of the year. That's our biggest sort of gap right now, is not having that available. So this is for maternal child health populations. My Chart is great, secure communication. It can be for condition only studies, of course. And so the person gets a notification, new research opportunity in their personal email, asking them to log in to their My Chart account, and they can update their preferences after logging in. And there's the dashboard. Note the research icon along the top there has been added. Next slide. So this is a welcome. This is My Chart research. This is who you are. This is how you might get these invitations. You can update your preferences, and then again the buttons I'm interested or no thank you can be clicked. And the details button basically expands the invitation to show the same content that's in the direct email invitation. Next slide. The options then are yes, I'm interested, and we're asking study teams to try to follow up within 24 to 48 hours of interest. No thank you, recipient will no longer be contacted for that study. Unsubscribed, recipient will no longer be contacted via us for any study. We do want to update this in time to, you could unsubscribe from direct email, let's say, but stay in My Chart. No response, you can be reinvited a maximum of 2 times, 2 weeks apart. And that's really direct email. As My Chart, the invitation just hovers there until someone says yes or no. Next slide. This is our research registry. I'm going to try to just blast through the last couple of slides so we can have a little bit of time. So here's our link. We're focused on COVID at this time, but it is a come all registry, all patient populations. We're really trying to focus beyond Stanford. We were able to use it to recruit over 90 participants for the COVID long haul study. And very soon I'll have the entire registry available in Spanish. And you can also enroll children and elderly family members, or like adult dependents. Okay, next slide. This is just a quick showing our study pages COVID directory. So we have, in a response to COVID, I was able to pilot with this company study pages for a really engaging type of clinical trials directory. And soon we'll be adding pediatric COVID vaccine trials and using a registry for that. So COVID has been this interesting opportunity to try out a lot of what we wanted to do and have been able to sort of expedite the process. And also I'm seeing this increase in interest in participating in research from the public. Next slide. And this workflow is showing the social media campaigns workflow option with study pages. So you can have different photographs to target different populations that then, if folks are interested, they can click on the landing page and take survey to see if you qualify. Then you can have a 3 to 5 question pre-screen survey, and then that can just be connected with your sign-up workflow. Maybe it includes a red cap link, and it comes with text messaging and a study phone number. And that is, that basically covers our resources. Again, I know it's a little bit more clinical trial focused. And again, we're always trying to have that community engagement mindset when we're doing this work. So I will stop there and take any questions, or we can circle back to some of the other discussion questions we were having.
And we will send the slides to you, so you have all of this information as well as our contact information in the future.
So Katherine, you have a question in the chat from...
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so let's see. And then I think there were 2 questions from earlier that I'll try to... So does PEP provide any support to increase recruitment for a study focused on a specific disease? Yes, certainly. So we take your inclusion exclusion criteria and build a cohort from STAR. So if you're adult patients only, one thing I didn't mention is that we do have postal mail available on a sort of case-by-case basis. It's a little bit of a bandwidth challenge for us, but especially for the adult population condition only, where we don't have My Health available yet, I try to offer postal mail. So certainly we can do that. Before we request support from your team, oh, sorry, this is a direct message. I'll answer you, Ellie. And then what did we have earlier? I noticed Susan, right, for Project Baseline. So we can circle back, Susan, and talk about postal letters. I think if it's re-engagement, we might have a higher response rate than typical postal mail, which might be around 5%. But I'd be happy to discuss that with you. And what was the one earlier we had? Oh, asthma, right? Yeah, I wanted to see if there are any tools available that may be used to help an investigator create an effective recruitment plan if their study is not accruing well. Yes, please reach out to me. Would love to talk with you about what could be a good fit for your study.
Thanks, Katherine. I was just looking over the Spectrum website. I was not aware of that particular availability of recruitment tools. So yeah, I'll definitely reach out to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll try to make our website a little more user-friendly.
Okay.
Other questions people have for specific studies? Great. So Patricia, if you want to share our contact information just as people leave, we'll want to really encourage you to reach out to all of us. We are excited to provide consultations and talk with you about your engagement strategies, and reach out with any questions following the presentation. So I want to thank you all for joining. Susan, I can turn it back to you. We gave you 3 minutes to close up. I hope that's okay.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your wonderful presentation, and very engaging and also very informative. It has really helped us. The resources that you have created, most of them, probably some of them were known, but most of them were unknown probably to most of us. So thank you so much for informing us and sharing them with us. And again, as a housekeeping reminder to everyone, please remember to complete the evaluation when I send it out. Hopefully by the end of today, I will send it out, and you have 30 days to complete the evaluation to receive credit. Please, if you want credit for this class, please make sure you mention your name, your full name, in the evaluation form. So thank you so much again, Lisa, Patricia, and Katherine, for your time and for your wonderful presentation. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending and participating.
Thank you.
And please feel free to continue emailing us with any questions and reaching out to Lisa, Patricia, or Katherine with any help that you need.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. And thank you so much again.
Thank you, Susan, for organizing. Really helpful.
Here.